Romans 1:16, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Verse 17, for in it, that is the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. So let me pause just for a moment and talk about the righteousness of God. I just want to go back right quick. The righteousness of God being revealed. It comes to those with faith. God has issued a verdict of righteousness upon the believer. All right, so the just shall live by faith. From faith, by faith, to faith. But it's not, I want to just revisit the notion that it's not our righteousness. God took His righteousness and put it in our account. The tendency is for us to think that we had something to do with that, either by our own righteousness. And when we do good things, we feel happy about that. You know, hey, I pat myself on the back. I did something good. God must be pleased with me. And while He may be, we don't just stop at that. We kind of continue on, and then we begin to think more about ourselves than we really should, and we get into this notion that now I have done something to warrant God to take the action that He's taken, and that is not the case. And so I think our conversation, going all the way back to a couple of weeks ago when we were talking, it was in here we were talking. It's really quick and easy for us to get in the land of subjectivity, where we try to convince people from an emotional basis or platform of why they need to be saved, or why they need to. We try to make that appeal to the flesh, and because sometimes we lack the verbiage, we lack the scripture, the capacity to demonstrate, you know, and after all, it's quite difficult to do. That's why I'm going back and revisiting that tonight in yet another attempt to try to demonstrate it's the righteousness of God that was deposited into our account. I don't want to make that any more complicated than it is, but the righteousness of God, the absence, it is, well, I don't want to confuse things. I'm going to lay that to the side. I'm just going to leave that deep stuff, but just simply put, God's righteousness, it was His. It was His to give. It was His automatically by His very divine nature, and it was deposited and is now recognized as yours. And so, for in it, in the gospel, why do we say that the power is in the gospel? Because in the gospel, the righteousness of God has been revealed to humanity. So when we look and we hear the gospel, and we declare the gospel, and then we move on and let that gospel seed begin to germinate, then we can trust and know that it's the power of God germinating in that spirit that we just left behind. And as we walk away, we can trust that God will have His perfect result in that. And as a consequence, now we can walk in the freedom and liberty of not burdening ourselves with this weighty thing that, well, I didn't lead them to the Lord, you know, doesn't seem now. And there again, we get back to that whole emotional thing where we try to be the ones to convince the person that they need what we've got. And while we're being sincere and genuine, it's really getting in the way of what God's actually going for, and that's that deeper thing. And He's able to penetrate that deeper thing with His gospel, because in it, the Word says, His righteousness is revealed. So, going on down, verse 18, for the wrath of God is revealed. So we've got a contrast here. We've got the righteousness of God, and then we've got that contrasted with the wrath of God. We see the polar opposites there. Verse 18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and all unrighteousness. So again, we have yet another contrast. We've got righteousness, God's righteousness, which has been deposited and given to us. Compare that now simply to unrighteousness. You know, there is no comparison. There's a chasm there. So we see that. So it goes on to say, of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. So we talked a little bit last time about just general revelation, just the simple stuff, you know, without having to know anything about anything. You know, we have just a general revelation that there must be something going on here. This is way too ordered and way too orderly for something or somebody, something not to have its hand in this situation. So verse 20 says, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes and his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. Now the they there would be the unrighteous men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. So they, as if the righteous truth could be seen, they suppress it, they hold it back, they disallow it from coming to the surface in order to continue in a way that they have made for themselves. So we have the general revelation. Man sees that, and man refuses to acknowledge that, and in so doing, he suppresses the truth. Not only in his own life, but we think about, you take a father or a husband in a family home, and we read where generational curses last, several generations down the line, and why could that be, or how could that be so? You take one unrighteous man who suppresses the truth in his own home, in his own marriage, and he propagates that that unrighteousness down the line, whether it's intentional or unintentional. So we see there now that the wrath of God is dealt out among that. Now we're not talking about lightning bolts and all that necessarily, but what we'll see here in just a minute is that God begins to remove his staying protective hand, and that being indicative of a wrath now, that as he lifts his staying protective hand, he gives man over to what man actually wanted to begin with. And we'll see that. So let's move on now. Verse 21. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations. And their foolish heart was darkened. Futility is just simply that. It's a waste of time. And when something's futile, it's simply a waste of time. It's not worth anything. But these individuals, even though they knew God through general revelation, they could tell and they could see it. The word says they didn't honor him as God. They didn't give credit where credit was due. And then, so the lesson to be learned here, or let me stop there and let me ask you guys, because I do want to mix up the format a little bit so that I'm not just this is not just a straight lecture. I want to mix up the format a little bit tonight and ask you. For even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and then their foolish heart was darkened. So I want to ask you, from verse 21, we recognize God, but if we don't acknowledge God, what is subject to happen? And I'll give you a moment to answer that. And I welcome it. I will give the microphone up too. Yeah, and I'm really doing it this way tonight because I want to prompt discussion while we go through this, so we don't have to wait till the end, and so we can get some of these thoughts out early. And
if you don't love the truth, that God will send a strong delusion,
send a delusion.
The minds.
Yeah.
Like if you're already headed, I don't know.
We put Mike to work. No, but I do want you to say that out loud so everybody can hear it, though.
I was just wondering if this is a parallel to the verse that says that if you do not love the truth, that God will send strong delusion. Yeah.
I can see where we could draw a parallel there, where I see it, but then I don't love it and don't engage in it, and that too being the wrath of God coming out on that, saying, look, you choose this path. It's futile. It's a waste of time, just as verse 21 says, and their foolish heart becomes darkened, and so I can see the parallel there.
I guess the question is, why would you, if you know the truth, why would you resist it, reject it?
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's because they want to continue doing what they're doing. They're satisfied in the lifestyle they're living and choose to continue on in that.
It's great, and that's really what I'm shooting for, because we see, I love the word speculations there, because to be speculative is not necessarily, it's not scientific, although it could be mathematical. Speculation is not necessarily scientific. It's just that. It's a scientific guess, if anything, if you want to even use the word scientific at all. So when one speculates about something, they make some assumptions, certain assumptions to be true. And here the word says they became futile in their speculations. They were a waste of time. They were misplaced and aimed in the wrong direction, because they saw and acknowledged, or saw God, but refused to acknowledge Him and put Him in His rightful place. And I think, going back to the moment where maybe we gave our heart and life to the Lord, we saw God, and we had a decision to make in that moment. And when we made that decision, we recognized Him as God, and then we put Him in His rightful place. And consequently, we would use the Christianese there and say, it was on that day that I got saved, or I was born again. And so in that, we too, like these individuals, were brought to that fork in the road, if you will, where we had a decision to make. And so as we get ready to enter into this next section, this next passage right here, which we all know, if we've read ahead, we know where we're going with this. It's really easy, and I hope to get to chapter 2 tonight to dive in on that, because there's some important stuff there about that. But we've got pagan behavior here. So verses 18 through 32, 19 through 32, really talk about a pagan behavior, a people who are irreligious and refuse to acknowledge God. When we get into chapter 2, we'll see the moralist behavior, and we'll see the religious behavior. And equally, all of those are equally as sinful. In different ways, nonetheless, they're sinful. And so a lot of what we see in our churches today may travel under the guise of the moralist or the religious, and be equally as sinful as the openly practicing pagan. And we'll look down our nose, our religious nose, or through our practices, and make certain assumptions about them, and also make certain assumptions about ourselves, and satisfy ourselves that we're in right relationship with God, all the while we too have been foolish and futile in our speculations. So as we move forward, I'm going to go ahead and move on to verse 22. Professing to be wise, they became fools. It was a process that the wiser they thought they were getting, the more foolish they actually had become. Once a man rejects Jesus, he will fall for more and more feeble and fanciful systems. That was one quote. I didn't give it credit where credit was due, but I think that's so very true. Once you start down that road, it's almost like once the dam breaks, it just rushes at that point. And so once a man rejects Jesus, he'll fall for more feeble and fanciful systems. Verse 23. So these fools, when they became fools, they exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, and of birds, and of four-footed animals, and of crawling creatures. It's vital that we constantly compare our own conception of God against the reality of who God is as He is revealed in His Word. We too are susceptible to worshiping a self-made God. And see, to be willing to admit that to ourselves, even in a small little church, even in a small little gathering, rich or poor, famous or not, we too are all susceptible to these same things. Now, that brings another point I'll quickly make, is that when we see others caught up in that same trap that we see here, we've got to be careful that we don't overstep our bounds as we evaluate where they may or may not be in relation to the Lord. Because it's God that can pinpoint the heart. I can pinpoint the actions. I can measure with my eyes and my five senses what's right and wrong from the exterior, but it's God who can pinpoint the heart and actually determine the intentions on the interior. And we've got to be careful that we don't position ourselves in a place where we play God. Now, now what I'm saying is not the fact that we're not to to judge at all and not to recognize sinful behavior as it compares to the Word. But we've just got to be careful that we don't begin to point our finger at somebody, calling them out, as we'll see in chapter 2, when we're guilty of the very same things. And that's what the moralist does. That's his behavior, and it's his sin. So, moving on, we talk about changing the glory of God for an image in the form of corruptible man. It's funny when you go back in the Greek there, and the word for image in verse 23 is the Greek eikon. Let me write it up here, and you guys tell me what it sounds like. What does that sound like if you were trying to enunciate that? Icon, doesn't it? Okay, so that's what it is. So we can imagine where we get our word icon, and we make icons out of these people: sports, music, celebrities of any genre. It doesn't matter. We call them icons, and those are images that we set up, and by default we begin to place our affections on these images, and before we even realize it, we're caught up into a trap now, and being caught up into that trap, that's how tricky the enemy is. So we have to be honest with ourselves, and we have to be willing to be honest with ourselves when we read the Word, to actually say, okay, yeah, get them, God, let your wrath be revealed. But we also have to be willing to say, is that me? Are you talking to me here? Because I can really point out, and I have you ever sat down and read the Word and said, oh yeah, that's how so-and-so did the other day. Smoke them, God. I've done that. And I could tell you, and I could write it down, and I never wrote it in my Bible, but I could write down certain people's names right beside these sins, and I could pick that out. But I failed, until recently, to be able to look at that Word and take one of those mirrors and lay it right there and say, is that me? Am I guilty of those same things? And the answer is yes. The answer truly is yes, if we were to be the least bit honest with ourselves. So anyway, we exchange. We're all susceptible to this. So in verse 24, therefore God gave them over in the lusts of their heart to impurity. Okay, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them, for they exchanged the truth of God for what? For a lie. Okay, an exchange was made. And it's something, when we trade something, I'll trade you this baseball card for that baseball card. That's an exchange. Here the exchange being made was a truth. I'll give you the truth. It's valuable. It's good stuff. Just give me the lie. Now who came out the better one there? And that's the thing. We've got to be careful, even in today's time, in just modern day, trying to filter and discover what the truth actually is. Now Jesus told us, you'll know the truth, and the truth will liberate you. It'll set you free. That's what I want. I want freedom, real freedom, not fake freedom, not the fact that you're free. Now go to work. Now pay this bill by the 30th of the month. You be here at 8 o'clock, and we'll march and hold our American flag, and we'll talk about how free we are. But are we? The kind of freedom that Jesus promises is liberty. It's liberty like no other. And what they did here, by not recognizing God, is they changed the truth. They made an exchange, the truth for a lie. Because the temporal pleasures, in other scriptures, it tells us that the pleasures of sin, it's not that they're not pleasurable. There's pleasure in that. There's fun in that. But they're only temporary. They're but for a season. And so these individuals, I dare say, through their futile speculations, got to the point where they said, man, it got to the point that they exchanged the truth for a lie. They lost their way, and now, not being able to find their way, became undiscerning as far as being able to measure what was and was not truth, and then end up in this situation here in verse 25. So they worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Now, going back to the icon thing momentarily, and I know I've got to move on, but going back to the icon thing momentarily, thinking about how we set up these people up on we worship the creature more than we do the Creator. And it's really easy to to think, wow, that person can sing. Wow, that person can hit a ball. Wow, that person can throw a ball. And what do? We build a stadium, and we sell tickets, and we shine big lights and put it on TV, and we ascribe value to that. And before we even realize it, we've ascribed so much value to that anything not taking part in that seems to have no value at all. When in fact, they've begun to worship the creature more than the Creator. And so sometimes my mind wanders, in situations like that, things, let's say a singer is a wonderful singer, or a musician's a wonderful musician. But I'm thinking, God, you gave us the ability to hear. You gave me the ability to hear this. You gave them the ability to produce the sound. You gave somebody down through history the ability, the mind, to create this instrument on which this individual was able to become a master of, on which another engineer was able to put it on a media of some sort, upon which I was able to go to work and earn money to buy the product that this person dispensed. And it comes, and so really quickly we can put our attention and affections on one thing, when in fact God orchestrated the entirety of it. Hear the words saying, just recognize the Creator. And we must not make the mistake of worshiping the creature more than we do the Creator. So we go on. For this reason, verse 26, God gave them over to degrading passions. Now, degrading is that process. It's a process of getting lower and lower. Degrading passions, for their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. Here we have yet another contrast, or a comparison. Natural versus unnatural. Through nature we understand what is natural, and what's counter to that is then unnatural. We recognize that. Again, going back, when we see what we see this day and time, we recognize that creature is being worshipped more than Creator in these things. And it's being celebrated. Celebrate this, celebrate that. Words like, joy and celebrate, and even word like gay, is really a fictitious. It's an exchange of the truth for a lie. Gay is to be happy. I dare say there might not be the kind of happiness long term there that they're looking for, although it's a play on words. Exchanging the truth for a lie. Verse 27. And in the same way also the men abandoned the natural function of the woman and burned in their desire toward one another, men with men, committing indecent acts, receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do those things which were not proper. Now, there's a comma there, but I'm going to stop. So let's think about this. We've got a situation now where Paul's not necessarily talking in a future sense. He's actually just recording. It's a statement of fact here. He's taking a look around. This letter to the Romans was written in Corinth, or from Corinth. So he was in a city where, when the temple and when the evening would come, 1,000 prostitutes would come down from the temples to go into the town to ply their trade. And as they did that, they would go in and this hypersexuality would go in. So Paul was familiar with debauchery. Paul was familiar with that kind of sexual sin. So it's not that this is new. It's not that he's predicting this. He's recognizing it as it is. And so this day and time, it's not that we're predicting it. We recognize it as it is. In contrast with what God would desire. So that's the thing. It's not that I'm ignorant. It's not that I'm less than. It's not that I need educated on these things. I'm very well aware of what these things are. I'm very well aware of what goes on. I can put two and two together. But even that is not the point. The point is this, is because, without getting political here, looking forward, I've got a week coming up where I've got to go be educated on this kind of stuff. And I find it amazing that in my career I've dealt with this for the last 26 and a half years, and I'm about to be educated on what bad people do with their bodies, in same-sex relationships, and why that's okay. So the people that are going to educate me essentially have exchanged the truth for a lie, as the Word of God would put it, and now they want to perpetuate that same lie upon me and upon us and upon the church. I'm not going to come away tarnished or stained by that. I can sit there with the satisfaction knowing of what God's standard is, and I make no apology for that because it was God's standard, not mine. I just happen to, choose that I believe I recognize God. I've seen Him through general revelation. I've met Him personally, and I believe Him to be of His Word. And here He says that is improper. So, to argue that or to try to get in some kind of political battle about what it is or what it isn't, I think if we, the church, might just spend more time just simply being the church and not trying to win arguments, it might be that it could be, I don't know, but I've just got this instinct, this little nudge, that if we would just simply just live and walk by faith and not by sight, and not try to convince people of our opinions and bring people over to our perspective, just toe the line, as it were, to us, then there's something curious in that, going back to verse 16 and 17. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed. For in us the righteousness of God is revealed as we abide in His Word. And so,
That somebody, a lost person, of righteousness until they're saved, God will reveal it to them.
Exactly. That really the command to us is to make disciples. Not to get people saved. Salvation is God's work. And the discipling is our work. And so we need to be faithful in doing that, which is what we're doing on an often basis.
Just trying to put that in words for myself, but we always try to convince somebody not to do the sin when all we ought to do is try to introduce them to Jesus and what He's done for them.
Yeah.
The love of God, not the conviction of their sin. God convicts them of their sin, and He'll bring them into right standing with Him, and it's through faith.
And I wonder if we, through faith, didn't just simply, when we run into those occasions, just announce the gospel. That Jesus Christ, the Son of God, was born of the Virgin Mary, and he lived a sinless life. He was crucified, dead, and buried, and on the third day He rose again from the dead, where He sits at the right hand of God the Father Almighty. And then walk away and then watch God do what God said He would do, because it's the power of God unto salvation. In it, His righteousness is revealed. It's demonstrated. The curtain, apocalypsis, the curtain's been pulled back, and we can see God depositing His righteousness in humanity. I wanted to say a couple of things in regard to this about God giving people over in the lusts of their hearts. God gives man over to his preference. In doing so, man is being allowed to experience the self-destructive results of sin. C.S. Lewis said it this way, and I'll try to say it correctly. I didn't write it down. But he says there's not but two kinds of people. So there's only two kinds of people. Those to whom they say to God, God, your will be done. And the other party, God says to them, your will be done. And I think that's very profound, because there really is a clear distinction. Because you're either going to humble yourself and follow God regardless of how difficult you find His requirements to be, or you're going to invent or create an image where it's comfortable for you to worship, and in so doing, it ends up being icon, an image, idolatry, those kind of things. So, it's helpful to understand there's two kinds of people. Those to whom to say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, thy will be done. In Hosea 4:17, it says here, Ephraim is joined to the idols. Let him alone. Let him alone. He's done that. Leave him alone. We mistakenly believe that it's God's mercy or kindness that allows man to continue in sin. It's actually His wrath that allows us to go on destroying ourselves with sin. So we think about God's wrath and lightning bolts and earthquakes and hurricanes and all that stuff, and yeah, maybe so. But the wrath of God, actually, Him just saying, okay, thy will be done, and allowing us to reap the consequences of what naturally will follow a sinful behavior.
after all, the creature and worshiping the created or worshiping the creature is basically showing the selfishness of man versus giving that up and believing in what God has said. So what C.S. Lewis spoke was very true. And the other thing I was thinking about, isn't what we are doing as believers is walking in the light every day, and when we do find places that are dark in our lives, then we need to address them. Because if we don't, then we're kind of on our own again, because we're just, again, starting to worship the creature instead of the Creator.
Right. I was sharing with Melissa tonight. We're saved, we're sealed, and all that, but all of this operates under a certain tension. Now, we take a musical instrument, and it's pulled at both ends. And when we pluck it, it sounds a certain note. And if it's under the proper tension, it'll sound the note correctly. Now, that string has to be in tune with itself, but it also has to be in tune with the other strings. And then that instrument has to be in tune with the other instruments, and so on it goes. So when we think about, we were talking about tonight, the difference between conformity or complacency, or contentment and complacency, rather. The word tells me to be content, but godliness with contentment is great gain. But if I'm complacent when the Lord's called me to move and do something, and I said, no, I'm just waiting on the Lord, then my contentment I've moved from contentment to complacency. I've moved out of obedience, and I've moved into sin. And so we're constantly, we don't just get there and stop. We're constantly having to make those finite adjustments on our lives. God's done the major work. But what we recognize is that for one, we've made the big leap initially, the leap of faith to come into this relationship with the Lord. And that was a huge leap because you think, well, what's the big deal? And we tend to undervalue it because for whatever reason, the Spirit of God woke us up and we came into this thing. And so the sense is easy come, whatever. It just came to me easy. But when we take a look around, we see that it doesn't come easily for others. We pray for others in their salvation and for the light to come on and see what I'm talking about. And it's like, I recognize it. Why can't you? So, again, walking these things out and just trusting that as we do, it's a demonstration of faithfulness in something that they can't see. I can't necessarily see it, although I believe it. Again, it's faith, but it testifies to something. Here, this testifies also. What we're reading testifies to what they believe, and the results just happen to be a lot more apparent because sin has its consequences, and sin bears out its results. And when it does, I remember in the 80s when the AIDS epidemic broke out. It broke out in the homosexual culture, and predominantly it was a disease that was among the gay lifestyle. Of course, they've battled that since the mid 80s. I remember when it came out, and they've battled that since the mid 80s, and of course we've moved on since then. But nonetheless, let me get on back here. God gave them over to a depraved mind. So God, they chose to do away with God in their knowledge. So depraved, debased. Some of your Bibles may say reprobate. But really what that is that which has not stood the test. And I think about that really applies to us. I want to overcome. I want to stand the test. I want to stand the test of time. I want to remain faithful. I want to continue this race to its completion in faithfulness. We get to verse 29. It continues. It says, they were being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving, unmerciful. And although they know the ordinance of God that those who practice such things are worthy of death. They not only do the same, but they give hearty approval to those who practice them. So here we've got a comprehensive list of what sin may look like. It's not all inclusive, rather, but it is a comprehensive list that we could, you could begin to get a good framework about what's being talked about here. Nevertheless, these are sins that can be seen initially. I can see that, and I know it's wrong. When I see it, it's just like, ugh, I feel that's wrong. Something on the inside of me just says that is not right. But when we get to chapter 2, and let me go ahead and move on into chapter 2. What time we got here? Or we could just stop there and have a discussion. I think I'd rather do that because I want to leave us time to talk about it. I baited y'all up for chapter 2 and never got there tonight. But I don't know that we're on any kind of schedule that we need to get done. I'm telling you, though, when we do get into this, chapter 2 is going to be awesome. Because it really is going to zero in on the folks like us. And that's why we need to be here and hear that. The moralist, the one that thinks he's doing everything perfectly. The one who's quick to look down his nose at everybody else. And the religious person that thinks because of his religion that he's good, that he can't be touched, that he's hadn't missed a Sunday, gives tithes of all he has, quietly slips the preacher $20, on the weekend, and that kind of thing. The religious person. So I'm going to pause there with the end of that. So we think about what we've learned for the last 2 weeks, just in this one chapter, what we've learned, and not to wear it out or anything, but clearly we can read this and it's self-explanatory. But what do we make of it? When I'm always faced with this, standing from all these times I've stood right here, I look at those double doors, and I don't know, they represent something to me. And I think about when I leave through those double doors, what am I leaving here with? What do I have tonight? What am I walking out of here with tonight that's going to change the way that I just do life? In all the roles that I play, whether it be father, husband, son, brother, employee, how does something like this change me? And I would have to I'd have to think about that before I answered it, but I certainly welcome anybody tonight. If I were to ask you that same question, when you walk out those doors tonight, reading this scripture, what changes? What's different? What do you recognize maybe that you didn't see before? And how's that going to change who you are? Because I really think that we need to get beyond the fact where we've come in and checked a religious box, come in and said, oh, I went to church Sunday and Wednesday. God owes me. And rather saying, I want to lay down, I can't get low enough, I want to turn into a slick spot on the floor before you because I see myself as I really am.